Namaste and welcome to Daily News Simplified, the what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today, we would be analyzing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper of 1st of September 2018. Now, let us begin. Now, we begin with the lead editorial on page 6. Now, this article provides two aspects with regards to Indo-US relationship. Now, the first aspect that this article provides are the reasons for engagement between India and the United States. And the second aspect that this article provides are reasons for concerns in the Indo-US relationship, wherein both these aspects and this article would form a part in GS paper 2 within the section International Relations. So now let us first understand the reasons for engagement between India and the United States. Now the first common engagement between India and the United States is that both the countries have a common vision for the Indo-Pacific region, wherein both the countries want the Indo-Pacific region to be based on the common vision of openness, non-exclusivity, rule of law, and thereby having the Indo-Pacific region open to all countries on an equal basis. And this common vision is mainly seen as being opposite of China, wherein China has been building military bases within the South China Sea and has various maritime disputes within the South China Sea with Philippines, Japan, Indonesia, among other countries. And because of this, India and the United States have formed a common vision for the Indo-Pacific region, wherein the Indo-Pacific region would be open to all countries based on a non-exclusive manner, and wherein each country would respect the rule of law within the Indo-Pacific region. And both the United States and India intend for China to follow this principle. The second aspect of engagement between India and the United States is ensuring the balance of China in Asia, wherein both India and the United States have showed concerns with regards to China's infrastructure project called Belt Road Initiative. Moreover, both India and the United States have also opposed the militarization of South China Sea by China. And in similar terms, both India and the United States have shown the intention of ensuring the balance of China in Asia. Now, the third reason of engagement between India and the United States is the recent engagement in the quadrilateral talks or the informal quadrilateral group with Japan and Australia, wherein the quadrilateral group is intended to form an Asian security architecture. However, in the recent past, India has shown reluctance to be part of the quadrilateral group, so we'll have to wait and see on how India and the United States engagement moves forward with regards to the informal quadrilateral group. Now, the fourth reason of convergence between India and the United States is the joint engagement for the reconstruction of Afghanistan and support of the Afghan civil government, wherein both India and the United States are working towards the reconstruction of infrastructure in Afghanistan and rebuilding of democracy within Afghanistan, wherein both countries also oppose the emergence of Taliban within Afghanistan. The fifth reason of engagement between India and the United States is the signing of foundational defense agreements between both the countries, where India and the United States have already signed the Logistic Exchange Memorandum of Agreement or LIMOA, and apart from the General Security of Military Information Agreement. And apart from this, both countries are currently in negotiations to sign the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement or COMCASA and the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement or BECA. And apart from this, there has been an increase in defense engagement between India and the United States, wherein recently the United States gave India the category of STA1, wherein after putting India into the STA1 category by the United States, it allows India to access critical and sensitive defense technologies from companies in the United States. And apart from this, India has also purchased the Hercules aircraft, the Global Master aircraft, and apart from other defense technology and equipment. And therefore, there has been a growing defense engagement between India and the United States. And apart from that, there has also been an increase in trade and people-to-people engagement between India and the United States, wherein there has been an year-on-year increase in the trade value between India and the United States. And apart from this, Indian companies have also been investing in the United States. And in similar terms, the US companies have also been investing in India. The seventh reason of engagement between India and the United States is the strengthening of Indo-US relationship through the Indian diaspora, wherein the Indian diaspora in the United States is considered a model minority, wherein the Indian diaspora in the United States have high academic qualifications, earn comparatively better than other minorities in the United States, do not engage in any form of security threats. The Indian community is also one of the biggest entrepreneurs within the United States, and therefore the Indian diaspora has played a critical role in the strengthening of Indo-US relationship. And the eighth and the last reason for convergence in Indo-US relationship is the US support to India in export control regimes such as the MTCR or the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Weisner Arrangement, the Australia Group, and the Nuclear Suppliers Group, wherein the United States has supported India's membership to all of these export control regimes. So now hopefully you have understood the eight main reasons given in the article for the reasons of convergence in Indo-US relationship. Now let us understand the various concerns that are highlighted in the article in relationship between India and the United States. Now the first reason of concern in the relationship between India and the United States is because of the US pressure on India to reduce its engagement with Iran, wherein after the United States pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal, the United States has put pressure on India and other countries to reduce their engagement with Iran, wherein the United States has asked India to reduce its oil imports from Iran. And in similar terms, there have been concerns with regards to India's investment in the Chabahar port. However, India has said that it would not follow the dictates or the policy of the United States and reduce its engagement with Iran. Wherein one of the arguments that India has made that India's investment in Chabahar port intends to help its reconstruction and rebuilding of Afghanistan. And both India and the United States are working towards rebuilding and reconstruction of Afghanistan. And we'll have to wait and see on how both the countries move forward with regards to India's investment in the Chabahar port. The second reason of concern in India-United States relationship is the US CAATSA law, which has put limits on India's defense engagement with Russia, wherein recently the United States gave an exemption to India to import the S-400 missile system from Russia. However, the exemption for the S-400 missile system was a one-time thing. And if India continues to have defense engagement or defense imports from Russia, each import would be applicable under the US CAATSA law, wherein if India imports any defense equipment from Russia, Indian companies which are part of that defense equipment imports would then be under sanctions by the United States. And because of this, there is a rising concern in India on how India's imports of defense equipment from Russia would move forward without having the sanctions under the US CAATSA law. The third reason of divergence between India and the United States is because of the US tough policy on trade tariffs that have been applied to multiple countries, including India, wherein both India and the United States are currently engaged in a dispute in the World Trade Organization with regards to the imposition of tariffs by the United States. And therefore, we'll have to wait and see on how both the countries move forward with regards to the retaliatory tariffs that are being imposed by each country on one another. The fourth reason of concern is that the United States has not formed a clear policy on the grant of H-1B visas to Indians, wherein Indians are the biggest recipient of the H-1B visas, and the Indian government has asked the United States government for a simpler access system for Indians to work in the United States. The fifth reason of concern is the lack of US ability to control Pakistan's cross-border terrorism, when India has continuously put pressure on the United States to ensure that Pakistan moves forward in controlling cross-border terrorism, and also to work against Hafiz Saeed, who was involved in the 26/11 terrorist attack. However, the US has been unable to ensure Pakistan reduces cross-border terrorism in India. The sixth reason of concern is that the United States has not committed towards the reform of the United Nations Security Council, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, wherein India, with other countries such as China, South Africa, Brazil, and other developing countries, want greater representation of Africa and Asia within the United Nations Security Council, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. However, the United States has been non-committal and is not working towards the reform of these organizations. The seventh reason of concern is the US government's commentary on India's internal affair, wherein the United States government puts out various reports and gives out various statements on India's internal affair, which India has opposed, and these commentary in forms of report and in forms of statements lead to a negative narrative in Indo-US relationship. And the eighth and the final reason for divergence in Indo-US relationship is because of the differences between both the countries on the common but differentiated responsibility with respective capabilities principle on climate change. Now you have to understand that the United States recently withdrew from the Paris Agreement, and India with other developing countries such as South Africa and China have always said that developed countries such as the United States, UK, Japan and others must do more and pay more in the reduction of CO2 emissions in the global atmosphere. However, the United States has been opposing the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So now hopefully up till here you've understood the 8 reasons of concerns or reasons of divergence in Indo-US relationship. So now question for your practice is evaluate the aspects of convergence and divergence in India-United States relationship in the post-2017 scenario. And you can try to answer this question with the explanation given in this section and with the help of the article. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this editorial from the editorial page on page 6. Now what this article talks about is the crisis with regards to the currencies of the emerging economies. Now you have to understand that this article talks about smaller emerging economies such as Argentina, South Africa, Turkey, Indonesia, Mexico, among others. Wherein what has happened is that the Turkish lira, the Argentinian peso, the South African currency have all suffered large losses. And there is a concern with regards to the poor performance of the currencies of the smaller emerging economies and their impact on India. And therefore, we have to see this article and the upcoming explanation from the perspective of your GS paper 2 within the section International Relations and the effect of the policies and politics of developed and developing countries on India's interest, wherein the effect that we would be analyzing is the crisis in currencies of smaller emerging economies and their impact on India's interest. Now, there has been an emerging crisis in the currencies of emerging smaller economies, wherein what has happened is that in the past decade, emerging smaller economies such as Turkey, Argentina, and others have heavily borrowed the US dollar, wherein these countries borrowed the US dollar at very low interest rate from the global markets. However, this heavy borrowing of the US dollar led to high accumulation of debt for the smaller emerging economies. But what has happened now is that there was a slowdown in the economic growth in smaller emerging economies such as Turkey and Argentina, while the European countries and United States have shown good economic growth. And these current scenarios have led to a reversal of the capital flow, wherein investors have now begun to reinvest in the US and European economies. And the decline in economic growth in smaller emerging economies has decreased the investment sentiment in these countries. Apart from this, there was also a change in the US federal interest rates, wherein this has caused US bonds and securities market to provide higher returns to investors as compared to investment in emerging economies. And lastly, the recent tariff wars between the United States and other countries have created an uncertainty in the global economy. So now hopefully up till here you've understood as to what has happened in the past and what is currently happening, and therefore you have gotten a basic macroeconomic overview of the changes that have happened. Now this change in the scenario with regards to economic growth had an impact on the US dollar, wherein the US dollar began to grow stronger in comparison to currencies of smaller emerging economies. Now there are three main reasons as to why this happened. First, because of the favorable policies by the US Federal Reserve, wherein because of the favorable policy of the US Federal Reserve, it led to more investment in US securities and bonds, and because of this, the US dollar began to grow stronger. And apart from this, there was also a devaluation of the currencies by emerging countries so as to make their exports more profitable. And lastly, there was also a reverse of the capital flows to the United States, wherein the reversal of the capital flows to the United States strengthened the valuation of the US dollar. And all of these reasons together allowed the US dollar to grow stronger in comparison to currencies of emerging economies, wherein it led to the depreciation of the currencies of the emerging economies. Now, the increase in valuation of the US dollar led to various concerns with the currencies of the emerging economies, wherein the strengthening of the US dollar and the decrease in the valuation in currencies of emerging economies led to an increase in the debt repayment of the emerging economies. So, now let's say, for example, $1 is equal to 50 liras, wherein lira is the currency of Turkey. And now, because of the depreciation of lira and the increase in valuation of the dollar, $1 is now equal to 70 lira. And therefore, if you consider that Turkey had taken a loan of $100 from the United States, it had to pay 50 liras initially. And now, because there has been an increase in the strength of the US dollar and the depreciation in the Turkish lira, Turkey would now have to pay 700 liras for the loan it took of $100. And therefore, the strengthening of the US dollar and the decrease in the valuation in the currencies of emerging economies caused an increase in their debt repayment. And apart from this, the second concern is that the increase in oil prices with a stronger US dollar and weaker domestic currency increase the payment for oil dependent smaller emerging economies. When if you take the example of India, initially $1 was equal to 60 rupees. So if one barrel of oil was worth $100, India would have to pay 6,000 rupees. However, now the dollar is equal to 71 rupees. And what has also happened is that the cost of a barrel of oil has also increased to 120. And because of this, India now has to pay 8,520 rupees for the same barrel of oil. And therefore, this increase in the oil prices and the increase in the strength of the US dollar, and coupled with the depreciation of the domestic currencies, have increased the payment for oil dependent smaller emerging economies. And apart from this, the smaller emerging economies now also have to borrow the dollar at an increased interest rate, wherein because the strength of the dollar has increased, international investors are now asking for a higher interest rate to give loans in the US dollar. And all of these three factors together have negatively impacted the currencies of smaller emerging economies, such as Turkey and Argentina, wherein the currency of Turkey, the lira, lost up to 40% of its value as compared to the dollar. And these similar concerns, which have plagued the smaller emerging economies, are being considered for the Indian rupee as to whether the crisis of the smaller emerging economies in their currencies would have an impact to large emerging economies such as India. So now hopefully you have also understood the concerns with regards to the strengthening of the US dollar and the depreciation of the currencies of the emerging economies, and how both of these factors together have caused a crisis with the currencies of the smaller emerging economies. Now, what you need to remember is that India has a strong economic growth, wherein India is currently the fastest, largest growing economy in the world. And apart from this, India also has a stable forex reserve and lower exposure to debt in the US dollar. And therefore, it is very unlikely that the current crisis in the currencies of the smaller emerging economies would have a major impact on India. But you have to understand that this news is currently in transition, and we'll have to wait and see on how the impact of the weakness of the currencies of the smaller emerging economies have on India. But hopefully you've understood the crisis in the currencies of the smaller emerging economies. Wherein a question for practice is highlight the reasons for the current crisis in currencies of smaller emerging economies, assess the impact of the crisis on India. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now, the first news that we would be analyzing would be from page 1 on the report of the law panel on the Uniform Civil Code. Now, before moving forward in understanding the observations on the law panel, you need to first understand as to what is the Uniform Civil Code. Now, in simple terms, a Uniform Civil Code is a set of common laws that have been proposed to replace the different religious personal laws that govern the citizens of India. Wherein an important aspect for you to remember, especially with regards to your prelims examination, is that Article 44 of the Constitution of India provides for a uniform civil code. And this article states that uniform civil code for the citizens, the state shall endeavor to secure for the citizens a uniform civil code throughout the territory of India. And this Article 44 is part of the directive principles of state policy. And both these informations become very relevant with regards to your prelims examination. Now let us understand as to what have been the observation of the law panel on the Uniform Civil Code. Now the first main observation by the Law Commission of India on the Uniform Civil Code is that it is neither necessary nor desirable at this stage. And according to the Commission, if there is an absence of any consensus on implementing a uniform civil code in India, the Law Commission felt that the best way forward may be to preserve the diversity of personal laws in India and also ensure that these personal laws do not contradict any of the fundamental rights that have been guaranteed in the Constitution of India. And according to the Law Commission, it is therefore desirable that all personal laws that exist in India must first be codified so that all of these personal laws cover all the aspects, and any form of inequalities that have crept into the codified laws should also be taken care of by amending the personal laws. And according to the Law Commission, a unified nation does not necessarily need to have uniformity, wherein according to the Law Commission, efforts need to be made to reconcile India's diversity with universal human rights. Now, moving forward, the Law Commission has also made the observation that the cultural diversity of India cannot be compromised. And according to the Law Commission, India's cultural diversity cannot be compromised to ensure uniformity of religious laws in India. And according to the Law Commission, this diversity both on religious ground and regional grounds, should not take a backseat to the opinion of the majority. However, according to the Law Commission, discriminatory practices within religions cannot hide or gain legitimacy from personal religious laws. And therefore, according to the Commission, the way forward for the Uniform Civil Code is for the codification of all personal religious laws so as to remove any form of prejudices, stereotypes that exist within any religion. And moreover, the codification of personal law will also test such laws on the grounds of constitutionality, wherein any changes in personal laws are also under the purview of judicial review. And according to the Law Commission, the codification of different personal laws will actually help in prioritizing and ensuring equality, and the imposition of Uniform Civil Code will not prioritize or ensure equality. And within this regard, the Commission has also suggested certain changes in personal laws, such as fixing the marriageable age for boys and girls at 18 years. Because according to the Law Commission, by having the marriage age of 18 for girls and 21 for boys, the law is making a social statement that wives should always be younger than husbands. And apart from this, the Law Commission has also suggested that adultery should be made a ground for divorce for man or woman, and also to simplify the divorce procedures that exist in various personal laws. And apart from this, of making polygamy a criminal offense for all religions. So now hopefully you've understood the various observations that have been given by the Law Commission of India on the Uniform Civil Code. Now Article 44 and the observation of the Law Panel on the Uniform Civil Code would first be placed in GS Paper 1 within the section Society and within the subsection Salient Features of Indian Society and Diversity of India, and apart from in the subsection Secularism. And moreover, Article 44 and the observation of the Law Panel on UCC would also be placed in GS Paper 2 within the subsection Indian Constitution, wherein the question was asked in GS Paper 2 of 2015, which had asked discuss the possible factors that inhibit India from enacting for its citizens a uniform civil code as provided for in the directive principles of state policy. Now you can try to answer this question because the Law Commission has given various possible factors that inhibit India from enacting a uniform civil code. And based on the UPSC pattern, try to answer this question in 200 words. Wherein in the 2015 UPSC mains examination, you were given 20 questions to answer in 3 hours. And therefore, using that basis, try to answer this question within 9 minutes. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 10. Now what this article talks about is that the US government has decided to stop all funding to the UN agency UNRWA, or what is known as the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Wherein you need to understand about the UN Relief Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees from the perspective of GS Paper 2 within the section International Relations and within the subsection Important International Agencies and their structure and mandate. And it is within this context that this agency becomes relevant for your mains examination. Now, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian Refugees was covered in the April edition of the Focus magazine. And this agency was in the news because it made a flash appeal for funds due to its inability to maintain functionality and being on the verge of closure. Now, this funding crisis happened because the United States was the largest single donor for this agency. And apart from this, this agency only relied upon voluntary contributions from different UN members. But the US government in March of 2018 reduced more than half of its planned funding to this agency. And this decision was taken by the United States as a retaliatory measure because a resolution was passed in the United Nations General Assembly which condemned the US decision to shift its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And because this US decision was condemned in the United Nations General Assembly, the United States government reduced half its funding to the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian Refugees. And because of this decline in funding, this agency made a flash appeal for funds to different UN members. And due to this flash appeal, several countries such as UK, France, Saudi Arabia, India, Jordan, among others, gave funding to the UNRWA, wherein India increased the annual contribution to the UNRWA to $5 million for 2018-19. But what has happened now is that the United States, which initially cut the funding to half, has now completely stopped the funding to this agency. So now hopefully up till here you've understood the current context as to why the UNRWA is in the news. Now apart from this, what you need to understand as to what is the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian refugees. Now this agency was formed after the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict, and this agency was formed by the United Nations General Assembly, and its main objective was to carry out direct relief and works program for Palestinian refugees that were affected by the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict. And now, because there has been no permanent solution to the problem of the Palestinian refugees, the United Nations General Assembly continuously renews the mandate of the UNRWA. So now hopefully up till here you've also understood as to what is UNRWA. Now as you might be aware, there was a question that was asked in the prelims of 2018 within the section Current Events of International Importance, which had asked the term two-state solution is sometimes mentioned in the news in the context of the affairs of, and you know the correct answer to this question would be B, Israel. Now you have to understand the context as to why this question was asked in the prelims of 2018, wherein the current event that had happened was that the United States decided to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, wherein Tel Aviv is considered the de facto capital of Israel, while Israel claims Jerusalem to be its actual capital. However, Jerusalem being the capital of Israel is disputed by many countries, wherein Palestine also considers Jerusalem to be its capital. And this current event of the US moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem supported the claim of Israel as Jerusalem being the capital of Israel. And the international importance of this current event of the US moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was that it negated the two state solution, wherein what has been the assumed solution to the Israel Palestine conflict is the two state solution, wherein both Israel and Palestine would exist as separate countries besides each other. And it is within that context that the claim on the city of Jerusalem would be negotiated between Israel and Palestine. But this US decision went in the support of Israel and thereby negating the two state solution. And it is within this context that the prelims of 2018 asked the two state solution. And what has happened now is that the United States has stopped the funding to the UNRWA. And the United States stopped its funding because the United Nations General Assembly opposed the US decision of moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And it is for this same reason and the same current event that the United Nations RWA becomes relevant for your prelims examination. But hopefully you understood the various aspects as to why the UNRWA is in the news and what is the purview and the mandate of the United Nations Works and Relief Agency for Palestinian refugees. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 11. Now what this article talks about is that the Telecom Commission has stated that it would form a National Trust Center. And the purpose of the National Trust Center would be to certify devices and applications for machine-to-machine communication. And apart from this, an apex body would also be formed for machine-to-machine communication. Now you have to understand that this apex body would be different from the National Trust Center, wherein the apex body would be formed to regulate machine-to-machine communication, while the National Trust Center would be certifying devices and applications for machine-to-machine communication. Now you have to understand that this news is currently in transition, and we'll have to wait and see on how the formation of the National Trust Center and this apex body moves forward. Now what you need to understand from this article is what is machine-to-machine communication for your prelims examination. Now machine-to-machine communication is a broad label that can be used to describe any technology that enables network devices to exchange information. And these network devices perform these actions of communication without any manual assistance from humans. Wherein previously a question has been asked in the prelims of 2018, which had asked in the context of emerging communication technologies, which one of the following term best applies to the above scenario, wherein the correct answer to this question was B, Internet of Things. And it is within that context that the understanding of what is machine-to-machine learning becomes relevant for your prelims examination. And now with this, we come to an end in the analysis of today's newspaper. Now we move on to the question for today.